Welcome everyone to the PRA policy webinar, COP9 and the future of harm reduction. This is on the record event. This webinar will be organized as a sort of conversation among these three speakers. At the end of the presentation, there will be a space for Q&A. This event will be broadcasted in the PRA YouTube channel. I'm Lorenzo Montanari, Executive Director of Property Right Alliance, an international research and advocacy group organization founded in 2005 with the main goal to promote innovation, free market, intellectual property rights, and free trade. Every year, PRA publishes two international reports. The International Property Right Index, that in the new edition will be officially launched on November 30, while the 2021 Trade Barrier in the Index edition, authored by our colleague Philip Thompson, has been recently launched in London in partnership with the Taxpayers Alliance, and is now available on the website Trade Barrier Index. There is currently a global debate about the efficacy of vaping in reducing smoking prevalence. While the debate is ongoing, there are eminent events in which vaping will be discussed, including the WHO Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, the so-called COP9 in the term of 9 edition. In our previous PRA webinar, we presented a white paper that explored the positive experience of 4 countries, France, UK, New Zealand, and Canada, who have chosen to build upon their existing regulation of combustible tobacco products by adopting a harm reduction approach toward electronic cigarettes. The case study indicates there is a clear and comprehensive evidence indicating electronic cigarettes are 95% safer than combustible tobacco products and are twice as effective as traditional nicotine replacement therapy. As a footnote, it is important to remind to our participants that 15 years ago, the World Health Organization has created a Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, STC, which main goal was to provide guidelines to government around the world about reducing tobacco consumption. The STC was adopted in the World Health Organization Assembly in May 21st, 2003, and entered into force on February 27, 2005. Since then, representatives all over the world have convened every 2 years to discuss tool implementation in which STC should be improved. The COP9, this 9 edition, is scheduled to take place between November 8 and November 13. And this year, one of the main topics of discussion will be focused on harm reduction and how to regulate. And this will be our main topic of the webinar. I want to thank our speakers, Houlbrooke from the New Zealand Taxpayer Union, Team Andrew from the Americans for Tax Reform, and also we just joined from Christopher Snowdon from Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you from London. Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you for your great effort on harm reduction, and thank you for the white paper that's been published a few months ago. So as I mentioned, we will organize this discussion in 3 rounds, one on COP9, the second one on best policy, and the third one, the last one, on call for action. So I want to start with all of you. What is COP9, how it works, and how it operates? Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you. What is COP9? Well, it's very different to COP26, which we're not hearing the end of in the UK at the moment. I didn't realize that went on for 2 weeks. COP9 only goes on for 3 or 4 days, which is a bit more acceptable, a bit more digestible. It's been held completely online this year. It was supposed to be held last year, got cancelled because of COVID. It was supposed to be held in person this year in The Hague, in the Netherlands, but again, cancelled because of fears around COVID. And it is, as the name suggests, the 9th conference of the parties, but specific to tobacco control. There are many, many differences between the COP meetings with the WHO and the FCTC, the tobacco ones, and the likes of COP26, but really you can name any United Nations conference will be very different to the COP9 meeting. In particular, the total lack of transparency, the contrast with the COP26 meeting in Glasgow couldn't be starker. There you've got rolling news. It's a headlines constantly, presumably will continue to be for 2 weeks, and that's not just because it's a different and perhaps some would say more important issue. It's because the organizers positively welcome the publicity. You have lots of exhibition stands there. You have industry there. So you will have the green technologies, but also some of the old fossil fuel companies and the nuclear companies will be there trying to explain how they can be part of the solution to climate change. Totally different with the COPs, even when they're held in person, especially when they're held in person. They're not just the tobacco industry, but the vaping industry. Anybody who's vaguely associated with either of these industries or even is considered to have similar views is totally barred. The WHO just this week, I think, put out their list of organizations that had applied to come to just to watch it online, not to participate, not to shake any hands, but just watch the thing online. And a lot of them were rejected. The New Nicotine Alliance, which is a British charity, I'm pretty sure doesn't have any funding from the tobacco industry, they were turned down. Finland, Action on Smoke Finland, which is a pretty fanatical anti-smoking organization, were also denied permission to attend. I'm not quite sure why. Interpol in the past have been denied permission because they've worked with the tobacco industry on the illicit tobacco trade, which seems a fairly sensible thing to do. So you're dealing quite genuinely with people who have a very fanatical mindset and a very prohibitionist mindset. It's been like this pretty much since the start. The conferences, I should explain, are all based around the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which is the WHO's first and so far only international treaty on tobacco. There have been various kind of ethical questions about it from day one. It's not clear actually why you need to have this level of international agreement on something like tobacco control, which is generally speaking a domestic issue and the domestic governments can work on themselves. But it's become, I think, a particularly big issue in the last few years because you haven't just got the WHO with their blueprint for stamp out tobacco. They're also now very keen to stamp out vaping, stamp out nicotine per se. They want a nicotine-free world. And in doing so, by being so opposed to new technologies like vaping, nicotine pouches, heated tobacco, they are working, as I and many people, including many public health experts, have been saying, they're working contrary to their own founding principles, which is it's supposed to be about health. It's supposed to be about getting people to quit smoking and not start smoking. And all the evidence shows that the tobacco harm reduction agenda has been incredibly successful in the countries where it's been allowed to take off in getting smoking down and saving lives. So the WHO now, in addition to all the traditional problems it's had with these meetings, its general mentality, the lack of transparency, the secretiveness, the prohibitionist drive that underpins it all, is now actually not just contrary to liberty and to economics and to trade, it's contrary to health itself.
Luis,
I'd say that if the goal of COP9 has been to be secretive, they're certainly succeeding. I know in New Zealand there has been zero media coverage of this conference, aside from material that groups like the Taxpayers Union have been putting out. And you can imagine if that's the case in New Zealand and countries with smaller media markets, developing countries, this conference is completely invisible. And it's in those countries where the stakes are so high, where smoking rates are highest, where they have lower incomes and hundreds of millions of lives are at stake, that this should really be front and center in the same way that COP26 is. At COP26, we've had a big headline in New Zealand. An Indigenous New Zealander stood up and delivered a presentation at one of the pre-meetings. Well, surely we ought to expect to see presentations from, say, smokers and vapers at COP9, but instead they're not only excluded from participation, but as you say, they don't even know it's happening. So the people that should be at the center of these meetings are, frankly, they've been made invisible.
And indeed, I would just sort of put this into the context of something Lorenzo said in introducing us just before you got here, Chris, which was Lorenzo said there's a lot of debate going on about the role of tobacco harm reduction. Now, this is true in a political context, but not in a scientific context. The science is settled. Like the meta-analysis of the papers, those conducted by Public Health England, the Royal College of Physicians, the Cochrane reports, over 60 of the world's leading medical bodies recognize and acknowledge the role that tobacco harm reduction plays. So when you have people saying there is a debate, this isn't a debate about the science. This is a debate between scientists on one hand and prohibitionist activists on the other hand. This is akin to saying there is a debate about whether vaccines cause autism or not. You have science on one side and you have radical activists on another. And the danger is that we are funding this. And I think it's very telling that these meetings are closed to the public, that you have anti-smoking charities refused entry. I think the last COP, you had journalists escorted by police out of the building because they wanted to cover these proceedings. If the delegates who have received, and bear in mind, the World Health Organization has received considerable funding from anti-vaping groups like by Michael Bloomberg. It receives significant amounts of money from countries like China, who run one of the biggest tobacco companies in the world. If these people had the sense of their convictions that they want to impose international vaping best practices and they believed in what they were saying, why not let the public in on the deliberations? Why not let people watch? Why not let there be debate, there be media, so that if there is generally this debate, people know. Sunlight is always the best disinfectant, as the famous saying goes. And the fact that there is this consistent refusal by the Secretariat to make public any of these activities, I think is very, very telling as to their agenda. Because if they believed there was a shred of science on their side, they would be transparent about it. The fact that they are refusing to do this means they know their refusal to embrace tobacco harm reduction is not supported by science.
No, thank you all. In fact, I always struck negatively from the secrecy of this meeting. Why media shouldn't participate, shouldn't report what's going on, what type of a discussion or level is bringing to the harm reduction or tobacco control. So how can we change the narrative from our side in terms of harm reduction? Because most of the time, people, they still believe that vaping is bad. So how can we change the narrative? How can we improve our grammar in terms of educational approach?
Well, I think the only thing. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, sure. We need to centre the experiences of vapers. In New Zealand, some of the groups that were first to change their tune on vaping versus tobacco and begin to promote harm reduction, they were frontline anti-smoking groups. And they were influential because they were dealing with real smokers and real vapers on a day-to-day basis. And even though ideologically they came from the real anti-tobacco end of the spectrum, eventually they just couldn't deny what they were seeing. And when they communicated that experience to the government, it was very, very difficult for ministers to argue against that. So ideally, vapers and smokers will have a voice, but secondarily, at the very least, the groups on the front lines that are actually talking to vapers and smokers and who've heard these amazing, powerful stories.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, I think you first have to acknowledge it's very difficult. I mean, the answer basically, I think, is publicity. That will then drive political change and drive public opinion. People need to know what this thing is, and they don't. And there are kind of fairly rational, logical reasons for that. This is a WHO, traditionally had a bit of a halo over its head. People wouldn't expect a WHO conference to be shrouded in sympathy and shrouded in secrecy and involving journalists being kicked out and so on. Also, it's tobacco. People obviously don't like tobacco. They don't like smoking. Vaping, has been said, it's been incredibly successful, and the science is all on the side of people who believe in tobacco harm reduction, but it's still a relatively niche activity, and a lot of people, thanks partly to so much disinformation that's been coming out of California over the years, a lot of people are quite suspicious about that too. So it's not an issue like climate change. We're not talking about the end of the world, and it's understandable that a lot of people simply don't care about it. That, I would say, has been the case up until very recently, when it was just about the WHO saying we think that every country in the world should put cigarettes in graphic warnings, packs with graphic warnings, or put the price up. It's understandable that only a relative handful of smokers particularly cared about that. Things have changed in the last 18 months, and from a publicity point, in a positive way, in that there is a lot more heat and attention on the World Health Organization. There have been very serious questions asked of its conduct during the pandemic. The halo has slipped quite a bit, and people are interested in it, and they're prepared to accept and consider that maybe this is not such a wonderful infallible organization. So there's an element of existing interest in the WHO and its possible misdemeanors thanks to its mishandling of COVID. And secondly, vaping is very different to smoking, very clearly different to smoking. It's been demonized in a lot of the world, largely thanks to the World Health Organization and people like Mike Bloomberg. But there are still islands and oases of common sense in the UK, in New Zealand, and a few other countries where the idea that vaping is, as dangerous as smoking is ridiculous to most people. And the idea that we should stamp it out while allowing the sale of cigarettes to continue is considered to be preposterous. So the short answer to your question is publicity. This is going to be a slow process. I've been trying to get people interested in the WHO and the COP meetings for years without very much success at all. People quite understandably have got bigger issues to think about. But we need to get more journalists interested in this issue. We need to get more politicians interested in this issue. We are moving in the right direction with this. There's been a bit more chat around COP9 than there has been previous COPs, but we have to acknowledge it's a difficult task just getting people to engage with the issue.
I think, Chris, one of the things that you stated quite correctly was there is still beacons of sensibility in the world, such as the UK government, the New Zealand government, both of which have taken a very pro-science stance in trying to help smokers quit. I saw that the New Zealand government has this great debunking myths section about vaping on their official New Zealand government website. The UK National Health Service, yes, exactly. That is in fact the one I was thinking of. Could have been the one I was thinking of. The UK government is, has been selling. You used to be able to buy vapes in NHS hospitals, and now there will be, in addition to the consumer route, there's also going to be the prescription route for vaping products in the United Kingdom. And I think one of the things we need to start thinking about is mobilizing governments in sensible countries to actually start putting pressure on the World Health Organization, particularly when they are still funded primarily. COP9 is very much funded by taxes. I believe the UK is one of the biggest, if not the biggest, contributor to a lot of these frameworks. And the power of the purse is important. I mean, this is one of the reasons that other countries have been leveraged so much power over the WHO so successfully is through and NGOs through the power of the purse. I think that some of the more sensible governments should start being more vocal about this, and people should be more vocal about this in their own countries as well, trying to educate politicians, raising awareness, raising publicity. But there was a case. Even just getting members of the media to be interested in this by getting them to come and visit a vape store. Do the same thing with politicians. There was a Democrat legislator in Rhode Island who was telling the story earlier this year that she was a co-sponsor of the bills to ban vaping in Rhode Island. So she signed the bills. She wrote an op-ed in favor of the bill to ban vaping. She was asked by some vape stores in her area to go in and just go and meet them. And she came in thinking, oh, all right, I have to do this. But thinking that, but then seeing everyone coming in, telling their stories, and it wasn't a planned visit that, she just came in one day, started seeing all the adults come in, say how vaping saved their life, their transformational life stories, all of the importance of flavors and all those other products. She went back, started actually doing some research, and then co-authored, started introducing bills to undo the bills that she supported in the first place, and sort of did this complete 180 based on the science. And this was simply by her going and visiting a vape store. So Julia Casimiro, Democrat from Rhode Island, I think one of the most open-minded lawmakers at the state level in the US. But getting people like members of the media and those sorts of things to start getting involved and hearing that personal testimony, which is so important. And we have to remember that people don't think this is important, but as I think you were all on the conference when the call we had recently on this, or some of you, I know Chris and Lorenzo, you were, but in the last year, more people have died of smoking-related illnesses than by COVID-19. Like, this is a pretty severe way, public health problem. If we can avert 95, the majority of those deaths through these reduced harm technologies, this is going to be one of the greatest humanitarian interventions since the invention of penicillin. This is something people should care about because it will save so many millions, tens of millions of lives. Actually, hundreds of millions. I think that the last best estimate was like 200 million lives could be saved over the next 10 years. Like, at no cost to the taxpayer. Governments don't need to subsidize programs. They don't need to pay for expensive research. They don't need to do anything. All they need to do is get out of the way and let the private sector fix the problem that governments have failed to fix for decades. Like the World Health Organization with plain packaging, which is what they put all of their eggs into one basket, failed. It has completely failed. It failed in the UK, it failed in Canada, it failed in Australia. Every single credible study that looked at plain packaging has found it's failed. Rather than admit that the government solutions have failed and that the private free market solutions have succeeded, unfortunately, a lot of them seem to be digging in because I think maybe pride is at stake. We need to show that this is such a powerful emotional issue and hopefully trying to get people to care.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you. And we want to move now to a second part of this webinar. I want to start with Louis. I know that you have been running a lot of the survey recently, so it would be great to have another view about your survey and having Chris and Tim commenting on that. Thank you, Louis.
Sure. The survey we released most recently was actually an independent survey conducted by a major polling house here in New Zealand. And it was a survey of vapers and found that 80% of vapers in New Zealand have used vaping to reduce or to quit their smoking. So 4 out of 5, that is a pretty incredible hit rate. If you're going to evaluate vaping, then surely you have to say that 80% of vapers have achieved something incredible for their health, and that is something we should be pursuing as a policy. The second set of surveys we've released is, again, from an independent polling company, and it's just the latest smoking data in New Zealand. We've already got really, really low smoking rates. They were at 12%, but then in the space of 1 year, they dropped to 10.5%. Now, this is at a time when a lot of commentators were giving up on reducing our smoking rates. They thought, no, we're already down to the hardcore few, the truly addicted. There's no way we'll be able to reduce smoking rates this quickly. But we've seen a very rapid uptick in vaping that has correlated with this unexpected improvement in our smoking rates. So it goes to show, just when you think that you can make no more progress on smoking, there actually is a tool that can unlock new benefits.
And you want to just briefly, if I could just add something quickly, contrast this to the United States, where after an incredible fall in smoking rates over the past since vaping started becoming part of the public, you saw for the first time in decades, smoking rates have started to go up and part of the main reason for this is the fact that in the last year, you have seen vaping bans in lots of states. Once you start banning vaping or reducing consumer access or just allow it or banning flavors, you have seen as a direct result of this, people making the switch to smoking. You've also seen in the United States a lot of misinformation about vaping, that people were told dishonestly that it was linked to EVALI. Everyone knew all along that EVALI was caused by illicit THC product laced with vitamin E acetate. That had nothing to do with legal vaping products. And yet this narrative was spread throughout the media, this false narrative, which caused people to go back to smoking. So in contrast with other countries, we have seen falls in the smoking rates, even factoring, yes, COVID does play a role and maybe people can smoke more through that. But you compare this with other countries and you can very clearly see that in the US states, which have started to restrict vaping, have led to an increase in smoking. And in fact, there was one study that looked at youth smoking in San Francisco. And immediately after there was a vaping ban put in, youth smoking doubled. And you could think, well, there could be a bigger trend. They compared it then to, and this was a Yale University study, they compared it to all the neighboring counties, which they still allowed for vaping. No increase in the smoking rates for youth. So this is like a very, very clear example of how the policies, unfortunately, are starting to go a little bit backwards here, in contrast to countries like New Zealand, where it is quite progressive in their public health policies.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence is really is, as Tim says, all on our side on this one. But the public don't seem to agree, and public understanding and knowledge about the relative risk has gone backwards. Certainly in Europe, certainly in America, I suspect probably around most of the world over the last few years. And that is, again, thanks to Mike Bloomberg and thanks to the World Health Organization. And this is a dirty fight. And, these people do not play nice. They've got a huge amount of money, and they will pretty much say anything they can to further their prohibitionist ideology. So going back to the question of what is to be done about this, the WHO needs to be taken on very directly. I think Tim's right that countries like the UK should be at least threatening to withdraw their funding, but that's not really the full answer by any means, because China will just step in with money. Bloomberg will step in with money. Bloomberg put $160 million behind the one policy of banning e-cigarette flavors, let alone everything else he's been putting in his money for. This guy is quite happy to go to his grave with not a cent left in the bank account, as long as he can spend it all getting things banned around the world and bringing in soda taxes and things like this. It's a dirty fight, and it needs to be taken on in a very serious way. And I think the only way we can do that is because the media isn't that interested in good news stories. The media's not that interested in going to vape shops and saying how many people have given up smoking. They're not that interested in saying how much the smoking rate has dipped in countries like New Zealand and UK because of vaping. They're not interested. They're interested in bad news stories. Well, the bad news story is that the WHO is incompetent and corrupt, right? And that is, that is the truth, unfortunately. And it's nicely illustrated with their attitude towards tobacco harm reduction.
No, thanks. It's very clear that all this anti-policy against the harm reduction are moved more by ideology rather than common sense or following the data, as Tim was remind us correctly. So the point is, what's going to happen after the COP9? There will be future about harm reduction. What is difficult now to answer because the COP9 is going to happen between November 8 and 13. But what is your expectation on that? We can start with Tim.
Well, I think that they've decided, because they know the science is against them, that they're just going to try and ignore the issue and just kick the can down the road. So tobacco harm reduction I don't think is actually going to be discussed at length at this COP9. The question is, therefore, what are they going to do in the next couple of years? It'll simply be using the old discredited science. They still, I saw, in the last year, that they were still relying on retracted studies, like the study that was found to be completely fraudulent by Professor Glantz, which claimed an association between vaping and heart attacks, without actually disclosing that a lot of the people had the heart attacks before they started vaping. So, and this is still cited by the World Health Organization. So the question is, if they're just going to say, well, we're not going to talk about this at this COP9, we're going to still see this still based on this discredited pseudoscience without any positive movement. And what could be even worse is, what are they going to do in the next couple of years if they just agree, oh, well, we'll just let one of our experts update all of our recommendations without it'll be even less transparent in the future. So this is unfortunately a missed opportunity, I think, for the World Health Organization to do anything positive.
Yeah, I know the New Zealand delegation to COP9 in the Pacific pre-meeting, they didn't even make a presentation, which is pretty galling, really, when locally in New Zealand, as Tim pointed out, our ministry is running public information campaigns that say vaping to quit smoking. They also have graphs that show that vaping is 95% less harmful. They even are telling smokers in New Zealand that you will save money on tobacco excise tax if you make the switch to vaping. So if that message is good enough for a local audience, why is that not good enough for COP9? There does seem a sense that because there is so little public attention on this conference, the delegates maybe think that they can just put their heads down. But the scale of the issue is so large that they surely have a moral obligation to pursue this question of harm reduction with seriousness. And in the case of a country like New Zealand that has Jacinda Ardern as Prime Minister and is potentially influential, we should be wielding that influence to save lives.
Yeah, and exactly the same applies to the British delegation. We're obviously no longer part of the European Union, so we're not part of the EU delegation anymore. We can make a stand on this. I think it would be a very good thing, actually, for what Boris Johnson calls global Britain to be making a stand on this. It's got everything he claims to be in favor of. It's about innovation. It's about being science-led. It's about business. It's got a lot of the things that Brexit Britain is supposed to be about. We shall see. I think the best case scenario realistically is that the whole thing passes without much going on. As Tim says, they have dropped everything about certainly vaping from the agenda. And so if they push that through for another 2 years, that's not a terrible result. It's 3 years since the previous COP. It's going to be 2 years to the next one. So they haven't really discussed e-cigarettes for 5 years. That's a bit of a result, actually. On the other hand, they don't really need COP, certainly at the top level of the WHO. They don't need COP to approve them of when they want to put out their mad Twitter threads about how e-cigarette fluid burns people's skin and all the rest of this kind of stuff. You go on and Google e-cigarettes, one of the first things you'll find is a WHO webpage saying that e-cigarettes are not safe and giving you a whole list of reasons not to go anywhere near them with not a single positive aspect of them mentioned. So the WHO can and probably will scaremongering about e-cigarettes, using its influence over developing countries, which of course is where it is by far the most powerful. We don't really care about the WHO and what they say in the UK, but they do in a lot of places because most countries haven't got the resources to be doing the kind of evidence reviews that Public Health England have done, and they rely on the WHO for aid in various different respects. So the WHO, I'm afraid, will carry on doing what the WHO does. It is, to labor the point, very difficult to do much about it. Nearly everything they say is anonymous, and they still have a massive halo effect. So it's a really big job to do anything about this. But I'll go back to the point Tim makes. Actually, sunlight's the best disinfectant. Let's try getting people thinking about this and looking about this organization. And we're not asking much. We're just asking that the WHO plays by the same rules as every other governmental and United States agency in being vaguely democratic and pretty transparent.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Tim and Luis. I mean, we are going at the end before the Q&A, but what could be a call for action for the harm reduction activists? I'm asking that because what really struck me in the US, there are around 10 million people vaping. They are completely organized. They have a meeting point. There is a kind of a grassroots movement. So what the other activists should do in UK, maybe in New Zealand, in other countries where to demonstrate that harm reduction is the, maybe it's not the perfect solution, but is the good solution to switch, to abandon the traditional cigarette and having a different lifestyle. What should we do in terms of implementing and facilitating an international grassroots movement? You can start with Luis.
Well, within COP9, one thing we've called on our delegates to do is simply to host a workshop or to call for the hosting of a workshop focused specifically on harm reduction. The fact that that conversation is absent from COP9 seems really absurd, and someone needs to make that push. Ideally, it would be a larger country, but maybe New Zealand is the one to do it.
Tim?
Look, I think Lewis and Chris have adequately said the things for that one, so I'll punt on this particular question.
I'll just say that, I was in Geneva for the previous COP8 3 years ago, and there were some activists there, and they did have a little protest, and I don't know, it probably didn't make any difference very much either way. But, that is often how things get changed. The European Union's Tobacco Products Directive was directly changed from being a really bad piece of legislation to being just a fairly bad piece of legislation, thanks to activists going to Brussels and protesting. And perhaps, I'm not an activist myself, but perhaps the people who are minded to get involved and get on the train and go to these kind of places should take a leaf out of the likes of Extinction Rebellion, the climate change protesters, and indeed the anti-smoking protesters over the years who've been quite happy to dress up as skeletons or pour blood over the place or whatever to remind the tobacco industry that their products were killing lots of people. I mean, the exact same applies to the WHO. So why not go on an emotive wing on this? Why not turn up at the WHO offices in Geneva and complain about them killing millions of people a year? This kind of stuff has happened in the past. It worked fairly well. The newspapers are kind of interested in it. So, the tables have turned in this respect really quite significantly. And at some point, I think the media is going to catch up with this, and the WHO are going to be seen as the bad guys in the whole story. At that point, we might see some kind of reform.
And look, in terms of the WHO being seen as the bad guy in the story, I think that we're going to see history in 50 years really look back at the fact that we have a billionaire in Michael Bloomberg using the World Health Organization to stop people in developing countries save their own lives. We already know at the moment people don't seem to look too kindly upon figures throughout history who sort of went and despite being well-meaning, would go out into the colonial era and try and impose their views on society. I think that there's at least a lot of historical debate about this. I think in 50 years there is going to be absolutely no debate whatsoever that what the World Health Organization and Michael Bloomberg is doing to developing countries, just because he personally doesn't like vaping, because he has said that he wants to ban everything because he has bad willpower and it's a psychological thing for him. Like, he's on the record about his reasons for this, that if he could, he would eat big burgers all the time, so everyone needs to be banned from having too many burgers. If because of the psychological weaknesses of one billionaire, millions of people are going to die around the world in developing countries, this is going to be, I think, viewed by history as even worse than people view sort of colonial imperialism today.
Thank you all. We are entering the Q&A section. There is a question from Georgina Agostini. How can private and public sector collaboration create more transparency and accountability? Who want to start?
I think the delegates at COP9 from the public sector need to recognise that coming from the perspective of a bureaucrat isn't necessarily going to be very persuasive or even very credible. I imagine that other delegations are similar to New Zealand's, where 4 out of 5 are bureaucrats and maybe there's one hired consultant. To be credible, these delegations should include people who've worked on frontline quit smoking services. And ideally, they should include at least one smoker or one vapor, just one. Just include them.
Or at least consult with them. But I think that, the first step should be what Chris said at the beginning, have the same processes in place that at all of the other conferences of the parties, like at COP26, where outside groups are allowed to participate and are allowed to sort of share their experience. The fact that anti-smoking charities are banned from COP is ridiculous. This should be an epic scandal. All that we can ask for is just the level of consistency, and the same level of transparency you see at the rest of the COPs.
Last question: how can we from Roman Savlovsky? How can we effectively enact change within institutions like WHO COP to make them more transparent and accessible to the stakeholder? It seems the transparency question seems recurrent among our participants. And any suggestion?
Well, we kind of covered it already, but I mean, I think it starts with getting people interested in this and getting some publicity around it. That then builds the political pressure for somebody to do something about it. You could bypass the public. You could just find some interested politicians who want to take this on themselves and going to insist that they are put on the delegation to this conference, and then they can go on and veto things. One of the good things about this conference is they need total consensus to do anything of any significance. So Britain or New Zealand or Canada, anybody could turn up there and just go, no, we're not having this on e-cigarettes or heated tobacco or nicotine pouches or whatever it may be. It doesn't take that much courage, really, as Lewis has already said. New Zealand's got this pro-vaping campaign going, which is directly contrary to what the WHO is saying. So yeah, use your veto. Any country can do it, no matter how large or small. So yeah, I mean, either of those ways works for me. Get the publicity going and put pressure on the political class, or just go directly to some politicians who want to do something about it. But the end goal is there's got to be change. I think it starts with the transparency. It starts with opening up this meeting so people can at least watch it. Hopefully, at some point later on, maybe people could even participate in it. Who knows? We can but dream, can't we?
If there is another comment from you, I want to thank everyone for your great comment and for great work on harm reduction. Thank you for the participant. I leave the floor to Tim Andrew for a very short closing remarks. Thank you again, and see you at the next PRA webinar.
Look, thank you. One of the hardening things, I think, is that we do have so many activists in so many countries just consistently doing the research, consistently trying to spread this message. I think, Chris, you've been at the forefront of this in particular since as far back as I can remember. And I know, Lewis, you've had a lot of success in New Zealand. But look, ultimately, we know the science here. And I would just urge everyone just to keep parroting the same message until it hits home. 95% safer, multiple times more effective than any other nicotine replacement therapy, and try and get governments to become involved. Unfortunately, this is an area where we can't directly necessarily influence the World Health Organization, but we can try and put pressure on our governments, because ultimately we are paying for this. Like, it is our tax in most countries that are paying for the World Health Organization. The halo has come off because we saw their complete failure in the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, where they were more concerned with cozying up to China rather than they were to addressing the issues of the pandemic. This may have been the latest in a long string of failures by the World Health Organization that we knew about but were never reported on. But at least the public are starting to think, well, maybe we can actually, and governments actually start to criticize and do things for the best. So we do have to get people to care about this because of the amount of the hundreds of millions of lives that are at stake. So I think just the more and more pressure we can start putting on them, whether it's be the emotive stories, using the power of the purse, just getting brave politicians who put on the delegation, or getting someone put on who will be able to veto things. And we need to start, in fact, perhaps preparing now, not just for this COP, but for COP10, when it'll be in 10 years.
Thank you, team. The battle is not over, but see you soon, eventually, after the COP9. Take care, and thank you, everyone, for your great work.
Thank you.
Thank you.